her, she, her, and I'm the new Director of People Development. I'm thrilled to be here with you all today on this very snowy Wednesday to talk and learn about equity. At the League, one of our strategic goals is to be an employer of choice through several focus areas, two of which I want to specifically highlight. The first is building a culture where employees feel valued and engaged, and the second is enhancing diversity and inclusion on our team. In evaluating our work and diving into the feedback from all of you, we seem to be succeeding in having employees feel valued and engaged. Are we perfect? Of course not. But are we on the right track? Yes. On the other focus area of diversity and inclusion, we are in the infancy of this work. And we have a long way to go to consider ourselves on the right track. But in looking at this feedback from you all, there is a desire and a hunger to do this work. And that gets me super pumped to drive this forward with all of you. So let's start today with a fantastic session on equity. Several of our employees recently heard today's speaker speak at the AWA conference and highly recommended she come and speak at the League. Dr. Mosby Tyler is founder of the Equity Project, an organization that is doing great work in our community to help organizations infuse DEAI into their work and cultures. She is an award-winning keynote speaker and the first Black woman to hold the position of Chief Inclusion Officer for Children's Hospital of Colorado in the hospital's 100-plus year history, and Executive Director of the Office of Human Resources for the City and County of Denver in the agency's 63-plus year history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mosby Tyler.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be with you, and welcome to our team members that are Zooming with us this morning. And I couldn't sleep last night. This is one of my favorite places. I have adopted pets over the years here, and I have fallen in love with the pets as much as I've fallen in love with you and the compassion that you have in our communities. Thank you so much for all that you do. So this morning, we'll take a journey. It's about an hour's worth of a journey, and I'm going to be sharing with you lots of different concepts I want you to think about. It's an interesting time in history. We're divided, and we're polarized, and we're debating, and that isn't what this session is about. I really do have a philosophy about how I do this kind of work. It's called Spaces Filled with Grace. A little bit different than safe spaces. I know you've heard of safe spaces before. Nothing wrong with safe spaces. I just don't use the terminology because I don't know what safety means for people. But I do know what grace means. So a space filled with grace is a space where you can learn and grow together. You can show up wholly and fully who you are. You can even screw up. You can maybe not say it the right way. Whatever that is, you get to fall and you get to get back up, but what you don't have to worry about is being judged or critiqued in the process. That's what a space filled with grace is. I wholeheartedly believe in them. It is the type of space that I think we need in order to have these kinds of conversations. So if you can just, we'll have our Zoomers do it too. If you could just raise your hand if a space filled with grace is okay with you. Just show of hands. Okay, we've got a lot of people that feel okay with a space like that. All right, I want you to be who you are, and I want us to learn and grow together. So let's get started. And I wanted to start with this photo because I'm one of those kind of moms. just so you know, here it comes. This is my rescued greyhound Lobo. He's 10 years old, and he's just bringing you greetings from our house. I love him very much, so I can't stop there. There's justice and there's peace. And you can pretty much look at them and know that there is no justice and no peace for any of us, including Lobo. but there they are, and they bring you greetings from our house too. I just wanted to share my babies with you. So a little bit of a check-in with you, and I just want you to sit with this for a moment. I don't know about you, but these past 2 years have been really difficult. They've been hard for me, and I know they've been hard for you, and there's so much we've had to balance. We've had to balance COVID-19, we've had this racial reckoning in the country, on and on, fill in the blank. There have been a lot of things. My check-in with you is this. I don't want you to pretend like none of this is happening. What we all have to bear is heavy, and we're all sort of going through it in these different ways, but I don't want you to skip over the gravity of it in your own personal life. You've got permission to be selfish right now because I'm just talking about you. I want you to know it is important for you to pause in some of this. Pause. Don't feel like you've got to do everything. Don't wear those or internalize all of these emotions as heavily as I think we've been doing it. Take care of yourself. My check-in, too, is to remind you that there's a phenomenon that's happening right now, and I want to give it a name. This thing that we're feeling, and we've been feeling for a couple of years now, is really called grief. And I know you know what grief is. We know grief when we lose someone that we love, and we know what that feels like. But this is grief too, because the world as we once knew it is forever changed. It's not going to be what it used to be. The new normal is what we're going to be talking about. So this grief is important for us to admit. And there's one in particular, it's called anticipatory grief. And it happens when we start having this feeling about the future when we're uncertain. We're filled with uncertainty right now, and so this anticipatory grief comes from the uncertainty. But the problem with anticipatory grief is when our brains look out into the future, it starts to imagine the worst. I want you to sit with that one for a minute. How many times have you been here where you do look out into the future, but it all looks bad out there? And in particular, I want us to be thinking about young people. Our young people, whatever that age range might be, everybody's younger than me to me, but whatever that age group might be, these are the people that are looking out into our future and wondering what good is out there. So when I think about this work we call equity, inclusion, and diversity, my brain always goes here. I want to do whatever I can in the world to mitigate this so that people can see hope when they look out into the future. So much of what we'll talk about today is to explore some of that. So keep thinking about these ways. I'll start with this cartoon. I started with dogs, now we're going to cartoons. It's my favorite image. It's the typical image around we're all in the same boat. And I've heard we're all in the same boat all my life. I think my parents used to say that a lot. We're all in the same boat, and I would just roll my eyes because I don't know that I believed it. But now I do believe it. I think there are enough things going on in this world that put us all in the same boat differently, but we're all in the same boat. We're all in the pandemic boat. We're all in a racial reckoning boat. We're all in economic crisis boat. We're all in the same boat, but differently. The point in this cartoon is this. I want you to always think about where you're sitting in the boat when you make a comment, when you form an opinion, when you make a decision. Where are you sitting in the boat when you do that? And have you considered the totality of the boat? What if you found out that what's happening in your end of the boat is not what's happening in the other end of the boat? What does that feel like for you? So this is a reminder to think about the totality of all situations before you make decisions. It's a good visual to remind us of that. So I also thought I would share with you 4 things that I'm seeing a lot of. I was just telling some of your teammates earlier that I'm so ready to be in the proximity of human beings. I'm so filled with joy right now that I can even be in a room with you. I've been Zooming and Teaming and WebExing for so long. But something has happened in a virtual environment for me. It just has allowed me to travel a lot. I've been able to be in Australia in the morning and back in Denver in the afternoon. It just makes it a little bit easier to get places. But one of the things that's happened to me because of that is I've noticed some themes. No matter where I am in the world, there are some things that are just the same no matter where you go. And these are things that I find get in the way of our ability to work together, to work in a collective. So I thought I would share them. There's just 4 of them. I thought I would share them with you so you could think about whether or not you've seen them too. So the first thing that I see, no matter where I go, is this thing that's called the recency effect. The recency effect happens to all of us, but it happens when we tend to remember the things that get presented to us earlier, but not the things that already got presented to us. It's like when you get home and you turn on the news and it says breaking news, and then 5 minutes later you turn it on and it says another breaking news. It's recency. It's the stuff that's in front of you right now. Now what happens is we tend not to remember what we learned a week ago, or a month ago, or last year. So the recency effect is like living in an episode or a snapshot. So I have 3 young adult children to go along with those 3 pets. So I have a 32-year-old, I have a 28-year-old, and I have a 26-year-old. And one thing that I continue to tell them when it comes to this is that I want them to pay it forward, but play it backwards. Pay it forward, play it backwards. It's my way of helping them to break up recency effect. If all you can remember is the thing that's in front of you right now, you miss the opportunity to connect the dots. If you don't know what yesterday has to do with today, you're going to have a hard time planning for what needs to happen in the future. So I want you to think about how you have seen recency effect show up. I just want you to think about that for a minute. How's recency effect showing up in your life? How are you seeing it? So it's a big problem. Here's the second thing that I see a lot of. I see a lot of this thing called compassion fatigue. Now, compassion fatigue is interesting because it doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about a lot, but it means you're overexposed to too many things that you need to care about. You're overexposed. Every day, recency effect does this, every day you get presented with new stuff that you care about, new stuff that you need to care about. And over time, that causes a fatigue. Again, it doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've got too much that you need to care about. But what I want you to know about compassion fatigue is it doesn't discriminate, doesn't care how much you care. It hits all of us. And when the fatigue part of it happens, it shuts us down. We can't do anymore. And people oftentimes will critique you when compassion fatigue happens. When it shuts you down and you can't do anymore, it looks like you don't care. It looks like apathy. So oftentimes when we're criticizing each other, you don't care about this. It's sometimes compassion fatigue that's really happening to people. So again, the sensitivity, the grace that we have to give each other about judging. This is a great example of how we judge people without knowing what's actually happening. All of us have probably been hit with, or used to be hit with, or gonna be hit with compassion fatigue. As long as we have something that we should care about every single day, new things coming in by the minute, this is a likelihood. So that's the second thing. Here's the third thing. I'm seeing a lot of this. It's this thing called imposter syndrome. Does anybody in the room, just show me your hands, have you heard of imposter syndrome? Okay, yeah, a lot of people have heard of imposter syndrome. Now it's a little bit like compassion fatigue in that it doesn't discriminate either. It doesn't care how smart you are, it doesn't care if you've got degrees or how long you've been working here, it doesn't care. Imposter syndrome can happen to all of us. So what is it? This is a big old academic answer to what it is, but let me just tell you what it is. It is chronic self-doubt. It is you believing that you are not good enough, smart enough, credible enough, fill in the blank enough, you really believe that about yourself. It's not based on any evidence, though. There's nothing that validates what you feel, but you feel it anyway. And I want you to think about those times where you've been in a moment or in a room and you just felt like you were shrinking for no apparent reason, like, I'm not the one that should be talking about this. Think about the past 2 years. We've been talking about race a lot. How many of you said, I'm not qualified to be talking about that? That's what imposter syndrome will do, and it will convince you that it's true. I want you to know that I don't want you to normalize imposter syndrome. I mean, you just walk around with it and you're like, here it comes, and you keep walking, here it comes again. I don't want you to have to live with imposter syndrome. So we have to develop techniques to help us to mitigate it or to get rid of it. So I get imposter syndrome a lot. Again, it's not based on anything, it's just a thing that you feel and you shrink. When it comes to me, and it does, I have learned this cheesy little technique that helps me get rid of it. So the first thing I did is I gave my imposter a name. I hope this is nobody's name in here or on the screen. Her name is Genevieve. Is there a Genevieve somewhere? Okay, all right. If there is, they're not going to admit it now because I said that. So Genevieve is my imposter. So whenever I start feeling that shrinking feeling, I acknowledge that Genevieve is present. And then I've got this subtle little thing that I do, because sometimes imposter syndrome can give you a visceral reaction in your body. So when it starts happening, I just do this. I just brush my shoulder like that. It's me brushing Genevieve away. It's just a physical touch and a physical reminder to me that that thing that's happening to me is not based on reality. Whatever it takes for you, find yourself a way to acknowledge personally in the most subtle way that it is present. Because the more you let the imposter just live with you, you'll shrink in more rooms than you can believe. I've spent a lot of time also thinking about what causes the shrinking feeling for me. It's not based on any evidence, but why do I have self-doubt, feeling like an intellectual fraud, not really sure if I belong? What are those reasons that that happens to me? So many times when you think about imposter syndrome, if we could think about it visually, it would look like this. It would look like you just believing that what you know is a lot less than what other people know, and you truly believe it. But the reality is what we have to focus on. The reality is you know a lot of things and other people know a lot of things. They might not be the same things, but that's okay. Or even when it comes to jobs, imposter syndrome will have you to believe that you're just a lot less qualified for jobs than everybody else, and you really believe that. But that isn't really true, but that's what your brain is saying to you. Or you just start to beat yourself up for things that are just out of your control, things people have forgotten about or didn't care about in the first place. Imposter syndrome will have you focus on the smallest little things a lot. You're hyper-focused on small things. All of those are symptoms of what imposter syndrome can do. So I see a lot of that, especially in equity, inclusion, and diversity kind of conversations and work. All right, here's the last thing that I see. You probably do too. I see a lot of discomfort and confusion about why we're talking about, why we're leading with, why we're centering on race. Well, the answer is we are. But the question is, why are we? Why are we centering and leading with race as much as we are today? And I promise you this is not a trick question, but it is a question in a very reflective way that I want each of you to try to answer for yourselves. There is no need for our answers to match. Let me say that again. There is no need for our answers to match. You just need to have an answer for yourself about why the centering on race during a time like this. What's important about the question I'm asking you to think about is the answer to the question has everything to do with your stories. And what I don't want you to do is skip over your story. This isn't one of those other people conversations. This is a conversation that includes you. There's something about your story, no matter who you are, that helps inform the answer to this question. And I want you to spend some reflective time doing that. What about your story helps you with this question? What about your story makes answering this question hard? What about your story, period? So I want to share a story with you. I'll model it for you. I want to share a story and an old picture with you. I have a lot of old pictures. I had the greatest mother in the world. She cataloged every part of my life. I still have kindergarten artwork in a scrapbook. Every single year of my life is in a scrapbook. So when she died, I moved all of the scrapbooks to my house, and every now and then I'll go through and find like my first birthday candle, all of those things. But this was one of the pictures that was such a gift to me. This is a picture of my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother lived in a town called Middletown, Ohio. Almost nobody has ever heard of that.
I went to high school there.
You went to high school in Middletown, Ohio? This is like drop the mic moment right now. Usually I say Middletown, Ohio, and people just go, yeah, no. And now we've got a graduate of Middletown High School. Okay, we have to talk. Anyway, that's where she lived. I love it. That's where she lived. And for those of you that don't know Middletown, if you remember the Andy Griffith Show and you remember Mayberry, it was kind of like that. I loved it. I spent every summer of my childhood with my great-grandmother, and I loved being in Middletown with her. One thing I loved about my great-grandmother, though, is that she was the best storyteller I've ever heard. I couldn't wait to get there and just sit at her knee and listen to the stories that she told me. I was mesmerized. Most of the stories, though, that my great-grandmother told were stories that her mother told her. Her mother was born enslaved in this country. And most of the stories were about her experiences being enslaved in this country. So I didn't learn about the institution of slavery in a textbook or in elementary school. I actually learned about it from my great-grandmother as she told me stories about her own mom and her experiences. So the institution of slavery was not 400 years ago for me. It wasn't abstract for me. It was as close as being at the knee of my great-grandmother. The other thing I want you to know about this story is the other little human being in the picture. That little human being's name is Mark. Now, Mark was my playmate every summer when I was in Middletown. And I was in Middletown during a time in our history when Mark and I weren't even supposed to be playmates, and we were anyway. Mark belonged to the family that my great-grandmother and my grandmother were maids for. You can tell she's in her maid's uniform in the picture. So they took care of 2 generations of Mark's family. Mark's family were the original slave owners of my family. Let me say that again. Mark's family were the original slave owners of my family. What a tangled web woven in that story I just told you. It's complex. And yet, Mark and I are still friends today. He's not in Middletown, but he's still in Ohio, and he's still doing great work. He's doing justice kinds of things. And our story together is a complicated one, but it in some ways ties us together. I want you to know that the power of our stories matters a great deal. There is not a wedge you could put between me and Mark, even though we've got these stories that are oppositional kinds of stories and painful and traumatizing kinds of stories. And when we put those together in dialogue, it actually brings both of us peace. That's what we have to do more of. So what I want you to do, I'm giving you some homework. Sorry. I know they didn't tell you that part. I want you to do this for homework. I want you to focus on the things that I just talked about a little bit more. I want you to think about how recency effect, imposter syndrome, compassion fatigue, and this difficulty and confusion about race is showing up. And I want you to start with yourself. Don't go other first, because we all as human beings talk about other things, other people first. Talk about you first. How's it showing up in you? Then go out. How's it showing up at work? How's it showing up in your family, those you serve? And I want you to just reflect on that, make a space to talk about that, and then spend some time thinking about what are we going to do? What are we going to do with some of these things? How are we going to heal them? How are we going to mitigate some of this? So let this be a little bit of the homework to do for our reflection work. Really important. Has everything to do with our ability to do equity, inclusion, and diversity work too. Okay, with all of that said, let me tell you about a conundrum that we have. We have so many words that people can't keep up with these words. Depending on how old you are, you remember when all we were talking about was equality. And then the next group of you were born, and then we were talking about diversity. And then the next group of you were born, and we were talking about inclusion. And now we're talking about equity. This is a conundrum, because right now, what's happening is people just don't know the difference between any of these words now. And we are taking it all in like they're all the same. And these words are not the same, they don't mean the same, and they don't even deliver the same things. So I wanted to spend just a couple minutes with you on deconstructing this just a little bit. I'm not patronizing you because I know you know what the words mean, but I want to tell you what they were attempting to do in our history. So when you look at these words, this is just 4 words. It's not all the words. It doesn't say justice and fairness and accessibility, so I don't want you to think that this is all the words. These are the 4 words, though, that get conflated the most. We use them interchangeably like they're the same thing, and that's why I'm centering on these 4. So this is just a continuum. We do all of this all of the time, even here at the League, all of the time. Sometimes what you're doing is diversity, sometimes it's inclusion. It just depends. But what I want you to walk away with today is I want you to understand that these words are also associated with social movements in our U.S. history. So when you look at these words, I want you to think about which of the 4 we've been practicing the longest in the United States of America. And it doesn't mean it's perfect, it just means we've been at it longest. I want you to think about that, because I think you win a new car if you get this right. It's equality. I won. Equality is the word that we've been at the longest in the United States of America. Equality is about providing access to people that didn't have access before. It's level setting. It's bringing one group up to the same level as another group. So examples of equality movements in the U.S., the civil rights movement is an example of an equality movement, providing access to people that didn't have it. The women's rights movement is an example of an equality movement. The labor movement is an example of an equality movement. The gay rights movement is an example of an equality movement. Those are just examples of level-setting movements that tried to give people that didn't have the same access. We're not perfect. We still have work to do there, but I wanted you to know that foundationally is the one that we've been at the longest. Now, the equality movement opened the door to the next movement, and the next movement was the diversity movement. The diversity movement was, the equality movement opened the door to differences. Differences were happening in the diversity movement in the 70s going into the 80s. So yours truly was a diversity trainer way back then in the 70s. And I can tell you, I hate saying this, but I trust you, I'm going to say it anyway. That's where we screwed up everything, back there in the 70s and 80s in the diversity movement, because I'm going to tell you why I'm saying that. The train had left the station with differences. That's what the equality movement did. Here come all the differences. And in particular, what we saw in the diversity movement were a lot more women coming into workplaces and going into leadership roles, because we had not seen that as much in history. We also started seeing many more people of color coming into workplaces, and we started to see people of color go into leadership roles, and we'd never seen that before either. The differences were coming. There were still identity groups where it was taboo. You would never talk about the LGBTQ community. I don't even know if it was an acronym yet, but that wasn't happening. So you still had this sort of sedating identities happening, even though we were in a diversity movement. But the thing I want you to know about what went real sideways in the 1970s and 80s in the diversity movement is the way that we defined the word diversity. And this is where we've got real work to do even today. Now, you know what diversity is. It's simple. It just means differences. That's it. It's one word. We don't need a paragraph. It's a word. It's differences. Now I'm going to give you a sentence. I believe it's the richness and the beauty of the differences of all of us. Everybody in this room and on this Zoom call are examples of diversity. It's all of us. Here's where we went sideways. Where we went sideways in the 70s and 80s is this is how we describe diversity. I'm telling you this because I was a diversity trainer that was there when it was happening. We describe diversity, the word, as everything that wasn't white. Let me say it again. We describe diversity as everything that wasn't white. So, if you were a white person sitting in the room, what you just heard is diversity wasn't you. Okay. If you were a person of color in the room, you just heard diversity was you. Okay. So that started the process of othering. Every time, if you were a white person, every time you heard these words, you thought they were about the other group. And every time I heard these words, I thought it was about me. That's what we did in the 70s and 80s. I call it the two great travesties. It's this travesty of what we did to white people in diversity training in the 80s, and it's the travesty of what we did to people of color in diversity training in the 80s. So the charge that we have right now is to fix that. We've got to stop misusing what the word diversity means. And what I mean there is we have to start saying what we mean. So I'm in a lot of rooms, especially in Colorado, I'm in a lot of rooms where I am the only person of color. And what I don't do is walk in a room and say, I don't see any diversity. I don't say that. I say what I mean. I say, I don't think I see another person of color in this room. I'm very careful that I say exactly what I mean, because what we've started doing is we've started to make race and diversity synonyms of one another. We're using diversity as code word for race. I want us to break that pattern because it's not code word for race. Race is a diversity, but it is not the definition of diversity. So catch yourself, because we have a pattern now. It's a habit that we've all formed. Catch yourself. Say what you mean. If you are a woman and you walk in a room and you're the only woman, don't say I don't see any diversity. Say what you mean. I don't see another woman in this room. Say what you mean. Be as explicit as you can. The more we can do that and stop code wording what it is, I think the more inclusive we're actually being about what it represents. That's diversity. The 1990s, that's when inclusion as a movement started. Now, it was a lot going on in the 90s besides our bad hair, but this inclusion piece has been bumpy. I don't know that it's been defined all that well. I mean, we say things like, we want everyone to have a seat at the table. Now, that's a big old table. We want everybody to have a voice at a table. I don't know if that's going to happen, but okay, it's nice conceptually. We say belongingness. We want you to feel like you're a part of the system. I want you to think about the core of that definition, though. If we want all of those things, you have to make sure the table is right before you start saying, I want everybody to be at it. The table isn't right if you leave inequities in it. So a part of what doesn't work well in some inclusion strategies is that we're not talking about the things that are barriers, which then brings me to where we are right now, equity. Equity is a tough one. You can call it equity. In some cases, we're talking about racial equity. It just depends. Equity is about creating systems where everybody in the system gets what they need to thrive. So equity is not about your heart or your mind. It's about your systems. Your ability to interrogate your own systems, scrutinize them, figure out if there are any barriers in those systems, and then making a commitment to get those barriers out. That's what equity work is. So all over the country, there's a lot of work happening right now in that area of equity, and I just wanted you to know that it is very different than these other three words. It is quite possible that you're working on all four of these. It works like that. But I do want you to know this is not a math equation. Diversity plus inclusion doesn't equal equity. It is possible to have diversity and not be inclusive at all. It's possible to do the first three and never get to equity. They all are very different, but I wanted you to know how to delineate the between those four. And you've seen a million of these images, I'm sure. None of them are perfect, and this one is absolutely not perfect because it doesn't represent spaces for people living with disabilities. But I share it with you for a reason, so you'll get my point in a minute. The equity and equality one makes sense. I told you equality was about giving everybody the access, and that's what that one represents, except it doesn't actually help everybody, as you could see in the first visual. Equity gives people what they need, and so that means that you don't all get the same kinds of things. But then there's reality. It's these last two I want you to pay attention to. There is a reality. This is where are you sitting in the boat. There are some people that have way more than they need. There are some people that have pretty much what they need, and there are some people that aren't even at level ground yet. That's the totality of the boat. This last one, though, says liberation. I tend to call it that's true justice and equity work. This one is obviously missing the fence, and that's the point. When you start doing equity work, you're concentrating on the fence. The fence is the barrier, the fence is the inequity, and that's what you're doing when you're doing equity work. You're getting at your fences. And when you can take the fence down, in this case, it's liberation for people, it's inclusion for people, it's justice for people, it's equity for people. So I want you to be thinking about that. What are your fences? Even here at the league or anywhere else that you're navigating, what are the fences? And what would it take to get rid of the fences? And if necessary, if you took the fence down, what would you design instead if you had to design anything at all? Sometimes it's okay to just say the fence is gone, and other times it's you've got to design something else. What would the potential outcomes be if you got rid of whatever that fence was? So fence work is equity work. I wanted you to see how that worked. All right. I want to just talk to you very quickly about something that could take all day, but we don't have all day, so I'm going to do the Cliff Notes versions of this. This whole conversation, diversity, inclusion, equity, and equality, also reminds us that we have to be in constant check of our biases. There are about 175 different kinds of biases that we have as human beings. All kinds. Affinity bias. We tend to kind of dig people that are more like us. That's affinity bias, and we kind of gravitate towards them. There's confirmation bias. We like people that will confirm our own belief systems. We kind of like that too. So there are all kinds of biases, but they all fall in these two categories. They're either conscious or unconscious. Conscious biases are biases that you have that you know you have. They're prejudices, like you probably don't want to share it with your neighbor, but they're these stereotypes and prejudices that we know we have. Unconscious biases are stereotypes too, but they fly under the radar of our consciousness, and half the time we don't even know we're having them. It's when you get on an elevator and somebody that scares you gets on the elevator and you start clutching your purse. You don't even know you just did that, and you just did that. That's what an unconscious bias will do. What I want to tell you about these two categories of bias is sometimes they're related. Not all the time, but sometimes they are. So I want you to start thinking about what your conscious biases are. That's what I want you to focus on first. What are the prejudices that you know you have? And how might they be creating some of those unconscious ones? Let me give you a clue about what I mean here. I told you not to share with your neighbor your conscious biases. That's your inside voice. But I'm going to share one of mine. I've got this conscious bias. I own it. It is a thing that I'm working on. But the conscious bias is, I don't think I like people that don't want to learn. Now, I don't mean go to college. I mean people that think they know everything and don't need to listen to you. I feel like I can spot them a mile away. I know what they look like. I know, I got you all figured out. I've got you pegged. That's a conscious bias. Now, it doesn't mean it's grounded in any reality at all, but I've got that thing. So I want you to think about that bias that I just shared with you. That's a conscious one. So what might I be doing unconsciously to people that I've decided don't want to learn? I want you to think for a minute, what am I doing to them? So you're probably thinking, she's ignoring them. She might be giving them a hard time. She might not be giving them a chance. I mean, in seconds, you can probably come up with a list of things that I might be doing unconsciously because of that conscious bias that I have. The way that you come up with it without overthinking it in seconds is exactly how you break your cycle. So the minute I start that's a person that doesn't want to learn, the minute that voice starts talking to me, I start working on mitigating it. Actually, I give those people more attention because I'm trying to break the cycle in my unconscious bias. So the more you can kind of play that out in your own biases, it's a good way to try to disrupt them. The reason I'm raising bias, especially in a time like this, a social time like this, is out of bias comes something that I want you to take very seriously, and it is microaggressions. Microaggressions come out of our biases. So what are microaggressions? And don't let the micro fool you. It doesn't mean teeny weeny. It means it's a microcosm of things that happen in a bigger context. These are huge, but microaggressions are these daily, they can be verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, insults, put downs that happen sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, that typically will target people that are already marginalized in systems, women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, and so on. These microaggressions have been normalized, especially in our workplaces. We explain them away. We say things like, oh, that's just Bob. Oh, that's just Sarah. I've learned how to deal with him. So we've normalized microaggressions, but I want you to know they're serious. So I own an HR company. Our biggest book of business has been working through claims and grievances on microaggressions, and they are beginning to turn into litigation. They're that serious. So I want you to know that microaggressions, I'll explain it a little more deeply. Microaggressions come in these sort of three categories. They're verbal. It's the stuff that came out of your mouth. You said something. These are real. This one, you're so smart for a woman. Okay, that's a microaggression. That's a real one too that happened to me. I also, because sometimes, I know, I've gotten the, Juanita, you're so articulate. And then my response is, what should I be? It's subtle, but it's a microaggression. You have to read what it really means. So verbal, some of them are just egregious and some of them are very subtle. Sometimes they're behavioral. It's not what you said, it's what you did. So this one talks about a scene at a bar. And the bartender is ignoring the transgender patron that's at the bar and serving the cisgender patron whose identity and gender matches his. He's absolutely ignoring the trans person, and it's obvious. And so sometimes you doing things like that over and over and over again can be the microaggression. And sometimes it's environmental. It's not what you did or what you said, it's what your environment says. So in this case, it's being in an office where this is like my lived experience being an executive in 2 or 3 different organizations. where all of the portraits on the walls are white men. There's nothing wrong with white men. I love white men. And there's nothing wrong with white men in a picture frame either. That's not my point. My point is, if the only thing that you see hanging on the wall is white men and you're not a white man, you start wondering if you belong there. Like, what is that the example of what leadership is or what success is? And so sometimes the microaggression can be even how you set up your environment. So I want to show you just a couple of pictures of people that are holding up a sign, and the sign has the microaggression that happens to them most often on it. And I just want you to see it. And while you're looking at these, I also want you to think about what kind of microaggressions have you experienced? Because nobody in the room is exempt, by the way. Let me just say that to you. A microaggression can happen to anybody in the room. They typically happen to certain groups of people, but no one is exempt from being the perpetrator, and no one is exempt from being the victim of them. Okay, so here's the first one. So this is what this person gets all of the time. So like, what are you? Now, I want you to know, microaggressions aren't, this just happened to you once. This is 1,000 little paper cuts. This happens to you all of the time. One time, maybe, but by the time you're at 1,000, you've created a wound. So this is a person that gets this all of the time. What's so hard about reading this one is, what are you, not who are you? And why can't we just say what we mean? Just like I told you about saying what you mean about that word diversity. Say what you mean. What's your real question here? Ethnicity, nationality, race, say what you mean. Okay, this one. You don't speak Spanish? Okay, so this is our bias. We've decided that this person looks like they ought to speak Spanish. How about the logic there? So over and over and over again, this person has to say, no, I don't, no, I don't, no, I don't. Courtney, I never see you as a black girl. Okay. Unless you're Stevie Wonder, I'm telling you, Courtney's a black girl. And I think we see Courtney as a black girl. So we know that means all kinds of things. It can mean all kinds of things. I don't see you as what my stereotype is of a black girl, or I just don't see color, or don't want to see color. Whatever it means, it over and over again, Courtney has to hear that. This is a student. The limited representation of my race in your classroom does not make me the voice of all black people. Now here, this is a person that's being tokenized. He's being asked to be the voice of all black people a lot, which of course he can't do. I tried it, it doesn't work. So this one is a microaggression. I don't know what you call it, so I just gave it a name, but I've heard this a million times, microaggression. So this one is putting your standards on somebody else. I didn't get any help, and I did just okay. And if you work hard, you don't need society to help you. I did it, you can do it too. Nothing's stopping you. That kind of, my profile should fit your profile, is a microaggression I see a lot. So again, sometimes it's not what you said. Sometimes it's just what the environment is saying to you. The Washington Redskins are fine. But if you happen to be a Native American, indigenous person, I would imagine it would be hard to see what's on this helmet for entertainment, and especially something that's very sacred for them. And then again, a picture of every conference room I've ever been a part of in my career. Sometimes it's just the environment. So homework number 2. I want you to just think about times where you have seen or experienced any of these kinds of microaggressions. I want you to be able to describe that for yourself. Don't just normalize it. And then I want you to start thinking about what you do to be an upstander, meaning if you witnessed a microaggression happening, even in this room, what would you do if you saw that happen? I'm glad you asked. I'm going to leave you with a tool. Because I struggled with it. I saw microaggressions happening all the time, and I didn't always know. I was a little bit awkward. I didn't know exactly what to do. So I created a strategy for myself, and I memorized it, so if something happened, I'd know what I needed to do. So it's a simple strategy with 4 steps. If I witness a microaggression or some type of injustice, I'm going to do one of these 4 things. I'm going to interrupt, I'm going to question, I'm going to educate, or I'm going to echo. Now, if it's something that's really egregious that happened, like it is bad, I usually use interrupt. So not that long ago, I was on a Zoom call, and the man that was speaking said he referred to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. And after my head finished spinning on its axis and the whole Zoom room was silent, I could just see the shock on people's faces. I thought, okay, Dunita, you're going to have to be an upstander. So I raised my little virtual hand, and they called on me to the virtual mic, and I said, can we go back to what you just called the virus? It was me using interrupt as my strategy. It disrupted the moment, and it did not allow us to keep going as if nothing just happened. So it was the right technique for the time. He had to recoil, and he had to apologize, and he had to get it right, and then we were able to proceed. And so sometimes that's what you'll have to do. The other ones are clear. Sometimes I just ask an additional question. What made you say that? Sometimes I educate. Let me tell you about a personal experience I've had. Sometimes I'll just echo, meaning I'm not the upstander, somebody else is the upstander, and what I'm going to do is affirm them. Thank you for saying something. So think about what you want your strategy to be so that you don't leave things that are not just sitting there in the room where no one did anything. Move from being a bystander to being an upstander is what my point is. So keep doing some work on that one. All right, quickly, I know we don't have much time. This is my favorite movie in the world. I'm dating myself, Rush Hour, and it's the most inappropriate scene in the whole movie. And that's my point here. We've got to start thinking about words. And I know that's a conundrum too, because it seems like every day there's a new word. Like, I have lived through, I was colored, and then I woke up and I was Negro, and then I woke up and I was black, and then I woke up and I was African American, and then I woke up and I was person of color, and now I'm BIPOC. I mean, I'm telling you, you can't keep up with what the acronyms and the words are, but we've got to some degree. What I don't want you to think is that you have to be perfect. It's bumpy when language begins to change. But the very first thing you can do is acknowledge where it's bumpy for you. Don't be afraid to say, I just don't get this. We're still actually struggling in lots of parts of this country with the use of pronouns. There are people that are still really struggling with that. It is bumpy because we don't have a cadence for it. We don't have a habit for it yet. In a lot of organizations we do, but in some cases we don't. Building these new habits and patterns and cadences is important. So this is all I want to say to you. Make a space to talk about words. It's so important. And I say start with number one. Start with a space where you can talk about words that irritate you and why. Every week on my staff meeting agenda, there's a segment on our agenda where we talk about number one, words or phrases that irritate us and why. And the beauty of that is you learn from each other what you might need to tweak about your language. Like when you say millennials and you start talking about it in a negative way, I'm on fire. I don't like it, and my head starts spinning, and attitude is happening. I don't like the negative attributes that we attach to millennials. I also don't like us to talk about them like they're children. They're 40 with kids. So my team now knows, because we've had this conversation, that not to ever misuse that word millennial. You need to do the same thing too, because what happens is people misuse words and we sit there and we hurt or we're irritated, and it builds into resentment because no one's saying anything. But make a space for it. I'm just giving you examples of words that trip people up. So we still are tripped up on Black and African American. We're tripped up on queer. We're tripped up on handicapped. Are we supposed to say that at all or call people that? Subordinates, that word is everywhere, but it's not a real empowering word, but it's everywhere. It's in policies. And then there are these trigger words too. And don't forget about trigger words. What are the words or phrases that trigger you when you hear them? Not irritate you, but trigger you. Racism, racist, white supremacy, gentrification, white privilege, Black Lives Matter, whatever those triggering words are for you, don't be afraid to talk about them, because the more you can talk about why they trigger you, you can get underneath the feeling that you're having there. And you open the door for, I think, the right kind of dialogue. So don't forget language as a conversation. All right, as we get ready to wrap up, because we're going to do some Q&A, right? Okay, good. I want to leave you with this one. I want you to also know, I've said a lot already this morning, but I also want you to not forget about power. We talk about privilege a lot, but we rarely talk about power. I want you to know about power because I also want you to know that you have some. This is a season in our history where we're talking so much about the haves and the have-nots, but we're also talking about I have power and nobody else has power. And some of that has just taken away our ability to realize that we all have power. We just have our power differently. This is a model that I want you to know a little bit about. It's 5 bases of social power. And what it says is we all have power. We just get it from different places. 1954 model, very relevant today. First one says legitimate power. That is the power that you have because of your title, your position, or your rank. Many of you in the room have some kind of position power. That's what legitimate power is. Now, what it does not say is that you have to be competent. Doesn't say anything about that. So don't get it twisted. It just talks about your title. We hope, and I know it's not like that here, we know that here, legitimate power is competent too. But I just want you to know that's not what the definition is. This is just position that you hold. That's where your power comes from. The second one is expert power. That's the competency one. This is your skills, your abilities, your knowledge, and your talents. But that one has nothing to do with your title. When I was the head of HR for the city and county of Denver, there was a woman in our housekeeping staff. Her name was Graciela. Graciela spoke very little English, but every day for years that I worked for the city, she'd come to my office at 6 p.m. She'd give me a little piece of paper, and it had a leadership tip on it. And she wanted me to use the leadership tip the next day. Every day she did that. So I said, Graciela, you have so much expert power. And she'd look at me and she'd say no. And she'd show me her broom and her mop to prove to me that she had no power. And I'm telling you, that's why I talk about power. People don't know that the thing that they have is power. And they won't know it until we start using the word power. We've got to be explicit about saying what we mean. So call it power. Those of you that have children or grandchildren, call what they're doing power so that they know that what they're doing is power. So use the word. Referent power, power of mutual respect. I respect you, you respect me back, therefore I have referent power. Reward power. This is, I have power because I have the ability to give and take away rewards, whatever that might be. And then coercive power, the power to punish other people. So I want you to know that we use all 5 of them. It just depends on what's going on. But what I want you to think about is the combination of power that you use most often. In the United States of America, regardless of system or sector or industry, number 1 and number 5 is the number 1 power-based combination, legitimate coercive power. That's foundationally what we use most. Our systems were built on the foundation of that kind of power. So you already know what I'm going to say. If we really want systems of equity that honor diversity and inclusion, accessibility and justice, 1 and 5 is not the answer. So what I want you to think about is how you're operating. What we need a lot more of is 2 and 3. We need more expert referent power. We need it in leadership, we need it on the ground, we need it everywhere we go in this work. We need more 2 and 3. The gap between 2 and 3 and 1 and 5 is what we're solving for. And so I want you to keep your eye on that. Where are you seeing 1 and 5 show up? How is it showing up in you? And how can you do a little bit more 2 and 3? How's that showing up? And how can we have more of that happening too? All right, this is my favorite James Baldwin quote. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We're facing into so much right now, and know that it is all about us having change. I want you to also remember the 20-60-20 rule. I love this picture so much. Not because it's me, but because I was at a conference talking to that lady and an ass walked up. Seriously. And it's dressed like me. Look at his hat. And then we don't know where it came from. It just sort of walked there, and it's just leaning on me. See, I'm a pet person. I mean, everywhere I go. Anyway, the picture has nothing to do with the words, but the words are, know that when you do this work, 20% of the people are going to love you and get what you're talking about when you talk about all of this. 60% of the people will be tentative. They're learning. They're trying to figure out how to operate in this work with you. And then 20% of the people are not going on this journey with you when you start talking about equity, inclusion, and diversity. I just want you to see this because I want you to focus what you're doing in the right places. Don't spend all of your time with the 20% of the people that don't want to engage in this work. I'd never give up on people, but we've got 60% of the people in the middle that want to learn, and that's where we ought to be focusing our time. So I wanted you to know this so that you don't get distracted by people that aren't with you. All right, I talked to you about a lot of things that you can do. I won't recap all of that because I've talked to you about it, but lots of things that you can do. All right, I'm going to end here because I want to do Q&A with you. Another old picture. Thank you, Mother. 5 years old, that's me in the picture, and wanted to be a ballerina. So I told my parents I wanted to be a ballerina, and they rolled their eyes, I'm sure, but my mother took me to a ballet school. And when we got to the ballet school, the people at the counter said, "We don't accept Negroes." So we got back in the car, my mom didn't say a word, and she just drove to the next ballet school. We got to that ballet school, they said, "We don't accept Negroes here." My mother then drove to ballet school 3, 4, and 5, and you know what they said at the counters at each one, because I already told you, we don't accept Negroes here. So this time we got in the car and I said, "Why don't they want me?" And my mother said to me, as only your mother could say, "Sweetheart, they just don't know how excellent you are yet," which is beautiful, except it's not when you're 5. I didn't get it, and I was devastated. Next day, I went to my all-black inner-city Atlanta kindergarten. I grew up in segregation. And that lady that you see in the picture walked in. And we were stunned. First of all, we'd never seen a white person in our school before, ever. 2, we had never seen one like her. She was a ballerina, and she was dressed like one. And she was just standing in front of us, and she said, "Good morning, class. My name is Miss Ann, and I'm going to be your ballet teacher." And that really is the end of the story. But here's the moral of the story. You're looking at a picture of when I think I first learned about equity, right there. And here's what I learned. I learned that equity can show up in unsuspecting packages. Fight your imposter syndrome. Don't let anybody convince you that it can't be you. I learned that it can show up in unexpected packages. 2, I learned that equity work takes bravery and courage. Remember the times we were living in? She wasn't even supposed to be in that neighborhood, let alone bucking the system, which is exactly what she was doing, disrupting. And 3rd, I learned that equity work takes love. And if you don't have that in you, you won't do it. So I want to leave you with that as we go into Q&A, because I think you all collectively and on Zoom are doing Miss Ann work, gender neutral Miss Ann work. I want you to know that you are the Miss Anns in people's lives, because sometimes just you showing up, you don't even have to do anything, just you showing up changes the trajectory of people's lives. And I want to thank you for doing that. That is the core and basis of what equity work really is all about. So thank you so much for taking this journey with me. Thank you. So I think I know I ran over time, but I think we have a few minutes for some Q&A. Any questions or thoughts? Did your head blow off, or is there anything that you heard that, yeah, can I come back there and bring you the mic, or can we run it back there?
I can also yell.
Okay, I can hear you.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about passion fatigue and kind of symptoms. We work in an environment that's pretty heavy in it, and also potentially touch on how it's stratified along racial lines.
Yeah.
Different groups experience different types of fatigue.
Yeah.
And how to recognize it.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So this is a little bit more about compassion fatigue and then how is it stratified around racial lines. So I'm going to work backwards in your question. Compassion fatigue looks different for every group because every group has its own kind of fatigue. So for instance, people of color are in a racial battle fatigue that's on top of compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is overexposed to too many things that you need to care about. Racial battle fatigue goes very specific to issues that you're fighting and battling with around race. So it's its own category of fatigue. I have had racial battle fatigue since I was 5 in that picture that I showed you, because every day I'm up against a thing that says you can't be here, you're not good enough, you can't, or you're the first ever in history, and so everybody's looking at you because you're the first ever in history. That racial battle fatigue is its own category for me. Layer it on, we're in a pandemic, we have all this stuff that's happening in the country that is the compassion fatigue. I think what we have to be really careful about in compassion fatigue is, to your colleague's question, everybody's in a different place and a different category in the compassion fatigue, and we've got to pay attention to that. There's a lot of trauma that's happening with the fatigue, and depending on what our compassion fatigue is about, puts you deeper in that category of fatigue. So you've got compassion fatigue. The best way to look at it is compassion fatigue is the big umbrella, and under the umbrella of compassion fatigue are people that are in racial battle fatigue. There's a gender battle fatigue. There's all these categories under it, and so you might have as an identity 4 or 5 different kinds of compassion fatigue going on at once. The solution isn't an easy one, and I can tell you that because I struggle with it too. What I have learned, though, is it is not my job to fight every battle. It is my job to do my part of it. I know how we feel because I know this is a room and a Zoom room of loving people. I know because you wouldn't work here if you weren't. But I also know loving people like us tend to want to solve all the issues. So I've had to learn how to set boundaries. I can do this part. I can fight this part. I can battle this part. I can advance equity this much. And then I have to count on the rest of you to be the multiplier. And then if you do it, and you do it, and you do it, and you do it, we'll get it done. So I've had to set some really defined boundaries around what I will do in order to sort of manage the compassion fatigue, the layers of it that I have. I really appreciate your question, and stratifying it that way is important. Other questions or thoughts, even if it's a thought or an insight? I'm going to start singing if you don't ask something. And I can't sing. It's a problem. How many of you are exhausted? I mean, if you thought about compassion fatigue, just show of hands if you feel comfortable. How many of you think you're in compassion fatigue? Yeah, it's happening. And I want you to think about industries and sectors too. When I'm in healthcare, the whole room raises its hand. When I'm in the education system, half the room raises its hand. I don't know of an organization that's exempt from compassion fatigue, but we can't just walk around and say we have it. We have to think about tools and techniques to help people that are in it get out of it. And some of it is, how do we help with the boundary setting? And it's tough. It's really tough. One of the things I want you to be thinking about too is, how do you build your muscle for talking about race? That's another thing. I didn't get into that very much, but that's another thing I see a lot of, is just, and some of it's imposter syndrome, and some of it is people really feeling like they need more skills. It is, how do we talk about race? Because it's loaded, and we need to talk about it. We need to be able to normalize the conversations about race, but how do we actually do it? I want you to be thinking about what that means for you. So my husband is a pastor. One morning we were talking, and I said, I really wish people felt comfortable talking about this hard topic. And he said, me too. And then we paused, and then we said, why don't we just have a thing where we just invite people to the church just to sit in a circle and let's talk about how to talk about race. And I said, that's cool. And we thought maybe 15, 20 people would show up. 1,200 people showed up that night. And it started a conversation about how do you talk about race so you can go back to your own communities and be the facilitator of those conversations better. So we started something called Race Talk University. And it's a cohort of people that just spend 5 weeks together, 1 time a week, learning how to talk about race. That's the whole goal. So you can go back and then you feel a little bit more equipped. I do think we need to do more of those kinds of things, even in workplaces. Are there ways for us to come together to learn how to do something, how to talk about race, how to tackle compassion fatigue, what to do with recency effect? So it's an idea that you might want to noodle around, is how do we do that? You have to think about what the topic area would be, but I think it would be a cool thing for workplaces to begin to do, the how-tos, given the time that we're living in. Any other thoughts or questions? I won't force the issue. You're amazing. I appreciate you. I really do. I'm trying to hold myself back because I want to go over into the other building. My husband said, don't you go over there because you'll come on with another animal. What's wrong with that? Yes, thank you.
Happy to give you a tour.
You'll never get rid of me either. It's like, where's that lady still here? 2 days later, she's still here. I'm going to take you up on that too. I won't do it today because I know you have stuff you got to do, but I'm going to come back because I just love you so much. All right, well, I'm not going to force the issue. I just want to thank you for your participation and just being engaged. I hope that there is something that you took out of today that you can use in your toolbox for how we tackle this wonderful world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming, and have a great day. Stay warm and drive safely when it's the end of the day.